Hello, hello. Welcome back to Peak Northwest, an outdoors and travel podcast by the Oregonian and Oregon Live, dedicated to the adventure and exploration of our beautiful Pacific Northwest. I'm Jamie Hale.
And I'm Vicki Connor. Together, we take you to some of the most beautiful and interesting destinations in our region, discussing where to go, what to do, and places to see. And today we have another installment of my epic adventure series with the story of a particularly epic Northwest road trip.
Vicki, I am super excited to get into this one. You know, when I came back to the Pacific Northwest 11 years ago and I started looking at what are some of the big road trips I could do in this region? I remember looking at the map and thinking okay, is it crazy? Is it too crazy to drive from Portland to Alaska? And I looked at the map and looked at the route. I did a little research, and I came to the conclusion that for me, way too much. That's just too insane to do. But that is a thing that some people do. And on the show today, we have someone who did it, who went out there and did this epic road trip from Portland to Alaska. Today on the show, we have Oregonian photographer Dave Killen to tell us all about his epic Alaska road trip. Dave, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Dave, I'm curious, what was the starting point with this trip? When coming up with this trip, what inspired it?
I think what was sort of the actual impetus for this trip was about 4 or 5 years ago. My then girlfriend, now wife, and I bought a extremely dilapidated 1977 Volkswagen bus with a pop-top roof, and that then spent the next few years fixing it up and taking it on ambitious but much smaller trips. We drove it at one point to Missoula, Montana for a Jason Isbell concert. Maybe a year after that, we drove it down to Northern California for a little vacation, and had been sort of continually improving it, and with all with the idea that someday we would take it on a really big trip. The sort of background of that was that Lauren, my wife, grew up with, her family had a pop-top Volkswagen, and they at one point took it on this epic trip that they all refer to as the big trip, which involved driving all over the United States. Lauren was young enough at the time that I don't think she remembers it super well. So the initial idea behind getting the bus was that it kind of combined our interests, because I, as a hobby, like to fix up old German cars, and she likes camping, and had a strong attachment to this particular type of vehicle and trip. So it was kind of a thing we could do together that we both enjoyed. And I had eventually, gotten it to the point where it was both mechanically good and reliable, and I had also painted it. It originally was a really outrageous sort of hippie bus paint scheme that it was not something that either of us could pull off, so it was important to get it a little more our speed. And so we had been hoping to do something like this. Lauren is a planner professionally, so she spent a lot of time, really probably starting close to a year before we actually went on the trip, really meticulously planning everything out. And then sort of my role was to sort of do the same, but with the bus itself, to make as sure as we could that we weren't going to get stranded somewhere. So that was kind of the beginning. And then eventually it was time to actually hit the road.
Yeah. Well, Dave, just doing a really cursory look at Google Maps for driving directions from Portland to Alaska, it shows it's 33 hours to 37 hours, depending on which way you go. That seems like a lot, actually, a lot of driving. But how long did you give yourself to do this trip?
Well, it is a lot of driving, particularly when only one of the two people doing it can drive stick shift. So I did literally all the driving, which was fine. Actually thinking of it in those terms, it's hard to believe that theoretically we could have done it, in less than 2 days if somehow we'd driven nonstop. But it didn't it didn't actually, we took 3 weeks to do this. So it never really felt, the driving part of it never really felt particularly overwhelming. There were a couple of days where Lauren had it sort of planned that when things were, kind of like we're just trying to get to the next location, or we're in an area that's not particularly scenic, we'll do, a long driving day. But a long driving day was like 8 hours of driving. And I've driven across the country 4 times. I've driven a lot. I drive a lot for work. 8 hours is not a huge deal. So it never really felt, overwhelming to me.
And so as you're driving through largely Canada, like the length of British Columbia and Alberta, where are you stopping? Are you staying at hotels? Are you finding little campgrounds? What was your plan there?
Primarily stayed in campgrounds and slept in the bus. It is, it's a fairly small vehicle by modern standards, but it can easily sleep 2 people, and in our case, 2 dogs, 2 medium-sized dogs. So that was mostly what we did. We did stay a couple of nights in, an Airbnb in Whitehorse in the Yukon. That was our first non-camping stop. And then we spent a couple of nights in a yurt in Alaska, which was, rented out through Airbnb or something similar. And we also stayed in a couple nights in an A-frame on the Cassiar Highway, which is how we got back down, which would have been in, I'm totally blanking on like where that would be. It was obviously in Canada, but I can't remember if it was in the Yukon or if it was in Alberta or British Columbia. But other than that, we stayed in campgrounds in the bus.
And so as you're making this drive, Dave, and you're heading up north, how is the scenery changing throughout the days?
There was a wide variety. And, I think I tend to think like the further north you go, the colder and the more mountainous and tree filled it gets, which wasn't really the case. It was for a while when we were in the Rockies, or the Canadian Rockies, I guess, near Banff. But once we got above there, it flattens out. Looks pretty similar to a lot of places in the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. There were days that Lauren had sort of read about being like less scenic or less interesting, and those were some of the days where we planned longer drives. But it's hard for anything to compare to an area like Banff, which I'd never been to before, and was really spectacular. So yes, it's a bit of a letdown once you get up into sort of the prairie area above that in Alberta or eventually the Yukon, but it's still very pleasant to drive through. I never felt, frankly, probably the least pleasant part of the drive was the first day heading from Portland up through mostly through Eastern Washington. Our first night was at a campground at the very, very tip top of Idaho, which is a very pretty area. But driving through Eastern Washington is not terribly interesting. So after that, it was kind of gravy in one way or another.
Well, tell us more about Banff. That's like, it has such hype around it, and I've not been there either, but my understanding is that it's just a phenomenally beautiful place.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible. I grew up in the Northwest. I've lived all over the country, but I probably spent most of my time in the Portland area. And not to disparage any of the scenery in Oregon, but it really is nothing compared to that. The drive from Banff to Jasper in particular is really amazing. And we had kind of an interesting experience, which, unfortunately, the fact of life these days is this was in September. So wildfires were going everywhere. And we had spent a couple nights at a campground near Lake Louise, which is at sort of the southern end of Banff. And when we headed north, and there's a name, I'm unable to find the name of this highway. I mean, it's like number 93, but there's a phrase for it, and it is really like nothing. It's hard to describe. Like it's like you had a series of Mount Hoods all next to each other, and you're sort of winding your way between them. So I'd seen pictures. I knew it was going to be spectacular, but it still was more. It was kind of mind blowing. Really incredible scenery. And the other thing, as I mentioned, there had been wildfires. So as we started off on that drive, we were both a little bummed because it didn't seem like we were actually going to be able to see much of it. Everything was just blanketed in smoke, which sadly we're all too familiar with now. But sort of midway through the drive on the way up towards Jasper that morning, it all just kind of cleared away and became a really clear, pretty day, basically just in time for us to see all this great scenery, all these mountains, glaciers, lakes. It was really, it was really amazing. And this was a 3-week long trip, but one thing I learned was that you could get to Banff in this area I'm talking about, in 2 days from Portland. You could really make a long weekend out of this if you wanted to, and it is spectacular.
I'm curious, Dave, this is a lot of driving with 2 dogs in this van. Had they been on a trip that was this long before? Were you wary about this? How did they do?
Well, I can't say for sure what they experienced before, because they're both dogs that we got through rescues, but they were both young. So I feel fairly confident that neither of them had been on a trip like this. They seemed to have a great time. They really, they're one of our, at the time, our older dog was 3.5 and the younger one was a little under 2. So he was still a puppy. The older one, Monty, they're both border collie mix. Well, Monty's a mix. Tristan, as far as I can tell, is a pure border collie, but, so, high energy dogs, but Monty is actually pretty mellow. He loves being in a car. He loves being with people. So he was, he's always just happy to be wherever he is. So he was having a blast. Tristan, I think, was also having a great time, but was a little more amped up. We learned that he either really, really loves or really, really hates caribou, because whenever we would see caribou, he would just lose his mind and spin in little circles on the bed portion of the bus and bark. And it was fun to see him so excited, even though sometimes the barking got to be a bit much. But overall, I can't think of any problems. We were a little apprehensive. The 2 things that I think we were both a little apprehensive about were the reliability of the bus, and what, if we would run into any trouble with the dogs. Not so much that they would, I've had enough experience with both of them to know that they would probably enjoy the trip. But, something, if they had some sort of injury, or, if we did break down and we had to get towed, would they be able to ride in the tow truck? Things like that were a source of worry. But in the end, they were perfectly fine, and I think they had an absolutely great time. I think a lot about, I'd love to know if they reminisce about it. I don't know if dogs reminisce, but I'd like to think that they had a good enough and profound enough experience that they sometimes sit around in their quieter moments and think, man, that was really cool. So, I will never know, unfortunately, but they did great. It was a great way to travel with them, which is, of course, not possible if we fly somewhere.
I'm sure Tristan dreams of those caribou at some point.
Yeah, I think, his view of them apparently is just as very large squirrels, which he also either really, really loves or really, really hates.
Well, Dave, I'm sure that you also reminisce about this trip. It sounds like just such an incredible scenic journey. As you're driving through these long stretches of road, I know you talked about Banff being beautiful. Was there anything on this sort of what you said is sort of the less spectacular part of driving through Alberta and through British Columbia, through Yukon? Were there any sites in particular or any memories that you hold from those long stretches of driving?
It's hard to really, it's hard for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was really all pretty amazing, and I actually like driving, so I wasn't really, I can't remember a time where I was like, oh God, get it over with. So, and it is, again, like I said, it's not terribly different than a lot of the scenery I've seen in the past in some areas, but it was never boring. So it's hard to kind of single out a particular stretch or spot as something that was, particularly more other than the Banff to Jasper area that was in one way or another, really stand out, because it all kind of blurs together in my mind. But I do remember we spent a night at think I'm getting this right, at Muncho Lake, which is in northern British Columbia. Yeah. That was really pretty. We actually ended up we did, despite Lauren having planned this out incredibly well. You do run into things. The wildfires made some changes necessary in terms of the route we took, and just other things that we kind of had to improvise a little. And we ended up staying at actually, it was a sort of a resort / RV park that we stayed at one night, and I believe that was Muncho Lake, and that was really beautiful. And I remember that, because you're right, we stayed right on the lake. I remember it got very cold that night. It actually got below freezing, which was, the dogs were great for that. There's not a lot of room in the bus to sleep, so they just slept in the bed with us, and it was very cozy, which was nice. But I remember that fondly. I remember I really liked, you kind of fantasize about like, oh man, maybe we could move to, the Yukon or something. That'd be cool. And like, I liked Whitehorse. And then scenery wise, when we were on our way back down, when we did dip into Alaska for a little bit, when we came out of a town called Skagway and crossed back into Canada, you really kind of, Skagway's a port, and we actually took a ferry there from Haines, and which it was just sort of the route, the way we did it. But you start climbing immediately when you're driving out, and then by the time you cross into the Canadian border, you're way up high. Sort of this, I don't know if it would count as a high desert when it's that high, but it felt like sort of a mountainous high desert to me. And there were all these alpine lakes, and it was quite cold, and there was still some snow, and it was just, I like that kind of weather and temperature and the scenery. And it was that drive, I remember thinking, rivaled the Banff to Jasper drive, which I did not expect to have anything else come close to.
Dave, did you experience any cool like wildlife sightings at all on this trip?
Yes, mostly caribou.
Yeah.
I was really hoping to see or hear a wolf at some point, and I don't think we heard them. We might have, but they were probably dogs, and we definitely didn't see one. We did see some bears in I guess that was Haines, Alaska. Yes, that's where it was, because that's where we took the ferry from there to Skagway. But it kind of felt like cheating, because it was really well known that there were, grizzly bears would come feed on the salmon in this one spot, and so we did see some there. And kind of amazingly, we saw a guy fishing just in the middle. He was fly fishing like in the middle of this river with all these grizzly bears around him. So that seemed, I mean, he clearly knew what he was doing, but it was kind of like, all right. But there were just a ton of people, like wildlife photographers, kind of all over the place. So it felt a little, not staged, but it wasn't quite as cool as it might have been otherwise. Although also probably better to run into grizzly bears in a situation like that than just randomly on a hike, which was something, of course, that we, worried about a lot. And we had bells to attach to the dogs, and we had bear spray, which we never needed. But it was funny when I have a lot of experience with bear spray from covering protests over the years. So I've been sprayed with bear spray many times, and I was just like, is this really, it didn't stop me. Is it really gonna stop a bear? But I kept taking pictures. But so we did see bears. I remember seeing at least one coyote. I'm a big fan of all canines, so even though coyotes are super common, I remember seeing the coyote. And some goats of some kind, some mountain sheep, I remember, on one of our longer hikes. Which the dogs are both herding dogs, so they were both like, "Oh boy, it's on." So we had to make sure that there were areas where they could be off leash, but certainly not on hikes like that. So they didn't get too far ahead of themselves.
Gosh, it sounds like such a rugged road trip. You're out there among the wildlife and the mountains. I'm so curious, like how were the roads and like the amenities out there? Did you feel like you were just like out in the middle of nowhere, or did you have some amenities to feel like, okay, if something bad happens, I'll be okay?
Yeah, you are kind of on your own a lot when you read. we read a lot. Lauren read a lot, especially. We followed a couple of like Facebook groups of like people who travel the Alaska Highway or the Cassiar Highway, which is how we came back down. So there are times where, yeah, you really you need to plan around gas, basically. Although there was really never a time that we were in dire shape as far as running out of gas goes, and we had a 5-gallon jerry can that we kept up on top of the bus just in case, but we never needed it. And as far as breakdowns go, this is a bus that's the same age as me, which is clearly quite old, and that I had done almost the entire every bit of work that could be done to it really over the last 4 or 5 years. It has a Subaru engine in it, which is a thing that people have done a lot in the last decade or so with buses, Volkswagen buses and Volkswagen Vanagons. It's easier on a Vanagon because they were they were water cooled to begin with, whereas the buses are air cooled, so you have to sort of create your own cooling system. And I'd gone through several different iterations of that over the years, figuring out what worked the best. So I was pretty confident, and I had a carefully selected subset of my tools with me. So I was sure we'd break down at least once. I just figured we would, but I was fairly confident that if it wasn't something catastrophic, that I would be able to fix it. And we, as it turned out, the only time I got my tools out was when we helped someone else repair their car. So when we left the house in Portland, we got about 3 blocks from the house, and I had a blinker go out. And I thought that was not a great sign. But as it turned out, that was the one and only mechanical failure we had on the entire trip. So, hey, take a 45-year-old Volkswagen on a 4,600 mile trip, and you'll probably be fine.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, Dave, I'm for obviously, I'm sure there's folks who listening who are hearing this and just going like, maybe I can do this. I know I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, not in my car I have now, but maybe, who knows? Maybe this is a trip that's more doable than I thought before. What advice do you have for folks who might be interested in tackling this road trip themselves?
Well, I think planning is key. And again, Lauren did all the planning, and I did all the bus work. So that was how we split things up. I think had I been left to my own devices on this, I probably would have it would have maybe been a disaster, because I am not a great planner. And that having everything mapped out so well really helped when we had to improvise, which, you're going to have to do, but it made it having sort of a structure and a timeline to keep to. And also, again, Lauren had planned it in such a way that no one day had a really extreme amount of driving. That was a huge help. So I would definitely recommend that. Plan. A lot depends on the vehicle. A lot of people, the bus doesn't get great gas mileage, even with the Subaru engine. I think it probably optimistically on the highway gets about 25 miles to the gallon and has a pretty small gas tank. We still had no trouble. But if you were driving a big truck, which a lot of people do, in that area that gets, say, maybe 10 to 15 miles to the gallon, and maybe, I don't know what the availability of diesel was, but I suspect sometimes it wasn't available when gas was. So that could be an issue. Doing it at a different time of year could also make things more difficult. I think obviously once you get into the winter, it's going to be a whole nother ballgame. So that would probably be something to take into account. I feel like the time of year we went was sort of ideal. Was still, once I was shocked, well, I shouldn't be shocked. I was annoyed that when we finally got back, in early October, it was hot, which I hate the heat. So I was like, this is great. We're going to be up north for September. It'll be nice and cool. And then by the time we get back home, it'll be cool again. But of course, there are no good months left in Oregon, so, except maybe November at this point. So we got back and it was hot, and I was annoyed by that. But most of the trip, the temperatures were really, I think, kind of ideal. Not just for personal comfort, but for like a car's cooling system, or if you did break down, like, are you going to freeze to death, that night? Probably not in September. So, and then, in terms of people worry a lot about ground clearance, because some of the roads, the roads, it's a rough place to be a road. And you get the frost heaves, which is when, in the freezing weather, the water freezes beneath the asphalt and can like push it up. I felt like most of the roads were great, especially considering, but I do know from reading about it that sometimes they can be a lot worse. So like, you wouldn't want to take like, a Ferrari on this trip, but you also probably don't need like a giant lifted truck. And in fact, since those are not going to get gas mileage, that's probably to your detriment. But I think in reasonably good condition, most vehicles could do it, but a lot of that would depend on the time of year and how much you're trying to carry with it, how confident you are. Good tires, I think, would be really key. Making sure your tires are in good shape, because the road is going to be harder on tires than it would be on than most roads like around Portland would be, I guess, depending. Some potholes down here too, but and just again, the planning was really key, and knowing where we were probably going to be every night, and just it kept the stress really low. Taking dogs was great, I thought. My advice is always to have a dog. but yeah.
Dave, with this trip checked off, are you or maybe Lauren starting to plan a next big road trip in the van?
Lauren is basically always planning the next big trip. But we have not started planning another. We've talked about it, but this summer we're not doing a big bus trip. So probably next summer, I suspect we will alternate summers or falls in terms of how we approach this stuff. We don't have kids, so it's pretty, open for us. And we've talked about doing maybe down to like Utah or the Southwest, like in New Mexico, or, that area. I can go, explore all my favorite Better Call Saul locations, which Lauren would not enjoy. So we won't do that. But it's it's too bad you can't drive to Europe, but maybe someday we would ship it over and drive around. That would be expensive. We did look into, you can take a ferry all the way from, I think it was, Skagway or somewhere up there in southeastern Alaska. We could have basically like split it up as like driving all the way there and then taking like a week-long ferry trip down to Seattle, I think it was, which essentially would be like going on an Alaskan cruise, and would have been cool, but was incredibly expensive. It was going to be like $4,000, and the dogs would only have been allowed to leave the bus for 15 minutes a day. So that was an absolute no-go. But
oh my God.
But yeah, in a world where we win the lottery or something, maybe we would ship the bus over to Europe and drive around Europe in the bus's homeland at some point.
Amazing. Well, Dave, when you do take that next big bus adventure, you got to come back and tell us all about it. Super excited to hear about it. And so glad you took this like really big, amazing, trip that I'm sure the two of you are going to remember forever.
Yeah, it was spectacular. And yeah, I think we both think about it a lot. And I just wish that I had a better memory, or that I could talk to the dogs about it. And I could refresh my memory. But yeah, it was fantastic. So I'm glad it worked out. There was a fair amount of pressure that I put on myself when I set out on these car projects, and it's nice sort of verification that I at least sort of know what I'm doing. But yeah,
I'm sure you have plenty of photos to jog your memory too.
I do. I should have brought a wider lens. Is what I kept.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Well, folks, until next time, you can watch our videos on the Oregonians YouTube channel and view all of our travel and outdoors coverage on OregonLive.com/travel, as well as HereIsOregon.com.
Please leave us a rating or review if you enjoy the show. And if you want to support this podcast as well as our local journalism, please consider a subscription to Oregon Live. You can find details at oregonlive.com/podsupport. Also, if you're a fan of the show and you're interested in potentially sponsoring it, you can get in touch with our marketing people at advertise@oregonian.com. This episode of the show was produced by me, Vicki Connor, alongside Jamie Hale.
Stay safe and happy travels, everyone. Until next time, we leave you with this 10 seconds of Zen.